Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar today, Enhancing WADA's Athlete Representation. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are in the world. My name is Ben Sandford and I'm going to be moderating the webinar today. So I'll just firstly take you through some housekeeping and then we'll be able to get things started. So there are three of us on the webinar today. There's Chelsey, who is the IPC Athletes Council Chairperson and a member of the WADA Athlete Committee, and she's a 12-time Paralympic medalist in para-swimming and a 3-time Paralympian, and has a lot of experience in athlete representation and governance. We also have Pengilly, who is a former skeleton athlete and 2-time Winter Olympian, and he's a former IOC Athlete Committee member and been a foundation board member within WADA and has also been on the WADA Athlete Committee for a number of years. The three of us are also on the working group for athlete representation, which the WADA Athlete Committee set up. And so the work on athlete representation within WADA has been ongoing for a number of years. I'm Ben Sandford. I'm also a former skeleton athlete like Adam. We spent much of our careers competing against each other, and I'm the chair of the WADA Athlete Committee. So in terms of housekeeping, you can ask questions, and please do ask questions. We've got some time set aside for questions. There'll be a couple of presentations which we'll take you through. And then we would really like as many questions as possible, so there'll be some time at the end for that. There should be a tab on your screen and you can go in there and ask questions, and I'll be keeping an eye on that as the webinar runs through. There'll also be a post-webinar survey, so please, once the webinar has finished, please fill in the survey questions, and that'll be really helpful to us. The webinar will also be recorded. So if you can't watch it all, or if you think it's amazing and you want to watch it again, or you want to share the recording on your social media because it's so good, please do that. The recording will be up on WADA's website, and we would like you to distribute it and share it as much as you can. And the holidays are coming up, so you might have some time to watch it a few more times. In terms of the real sort of details of housekeeping, just a quick note about WADA's privacy policy. WADA will not use any personal information for any direct marketing or unsolicited follow-up unless you have first informed of this and expressly consented to it. And WADA will not share personal information with third parties except where required by law or legal process. So that's the housekeeping done for the day. Just finally, I'd like to say this is I think the fourth in a series of athlete webinars that we put on this year. So thank you for joining us for these webinars. I hope they've been helpful. This is the last one that we'll have before Christmas. So yeah, please sit back and enjoy enhancing WADA's athlete representation and think of some good questions to ask. So I'll hand it over to Adam to get things started.
Thanks very much, Ben. Hi everyone, it's good to be here. And so a brief bit of background of the Athlete Committee and Working Group is what we'll start off with. Following on from that, the presentation will have, or my part of it will have progress to date of our working group. We'll talk about the purpose, we'll be clear on that, the principles. We'll touch on Athlete Committee size, what's happened in the past and where we're looking to go. I'll present the 3 models that we've so far come up with, and then give you some of the feedback that we've had to date, followed by next steps. So that's kind of overview of what you'll see from me, and then after that Chelsey will be taking over to improve things, I'm sure. So that's the content. So we're going to start off with the background of the Athlete Committee and the working group. So WADA was established in '99, as I'm sure many of you will know, and then in 2005 the first meeting of WADA's Athlete Committee took place. Not much, well, it stayed much the same for quite some time after that, In 2014, there was a structural change within the Athlete Committee, and the 4 IOC Athlete Commission members who sit on the foundation board, they came onto the committee, the Athlete Committee, as ex officio members, with full voting rights and the same rights as everyone else. In 2018, WADA completed a governance review, and they set some recommendations. Within those recommendations, however, there was limited development of governance around athletes and athlete representation. One thing that they did recognise were that athletes are a distinct stakeholder, a separate stakeholder within the anti-doping movement. They recognised that the Athlete Committee, in the view of the working group, was an expert group more than a representational group. And that was generally because the members are appointed. At that time, they were appointed mainly by the chair, but also with a strong input from the WADA president and WADA director general. But given that expert rather than representational position, there's no decision-making positions for the Athlete Committee, and a consequence of this was that WADA Athlete Committee decided to set up a working group to address and develop the current situation. So the working group is made up of the following 6 people. As you can see, Chelsey and Ben are there. We've also got Kadi Kanute from Mali. We've got Lina from China and Emma Tere from Finland. We've got a good spread. We cover all the 5 continents, and we start early in the morning and finish late at night because Chelsey is in the eastern side of the state, or the North America, and Ben's obviously in Oceania and down in New Zealand. And we're all in the middle. So getting meeting times can be a bit of a challenge, but that's the group. It's quite diverse. At the beginning, we decided that we need to be clear on what our purpose was. And so after some discussion and debate, this is what we came up with: to create a new structure and mechanism of selection for the WADA Athlete Committee that enables the best possible and most effective representation of athletes within all levels of WADA and the anti-doping movement. That purpose is obviously fairly clear and self-explanatory. Within that, we had some underpinning principles. The first and most important being athletes choose their representatives. If you're going to represent someone, that person has to have played a significant role, if not a sole role, in the decision of who they want to represent them. And therefore, athletes are going to do that. It may not be, there are obviously different ways of doing this. Election and appointment are the primary ways, but that was an underpinning first principle. We followed that with additional principles, which I guess are fairly standard within this sort of project. We basically wanted key athlete stakeholders and groups to be represented. So obviously we want Olympic athletes there, we want Paralympic athletes there, we want athletes who are bound by the code but not in Olympic or Paralympic, so recognised sports, for example. Is also important that there's about professional sport as well, is another key stakeholder group. Another principle that we want to make sure this is very much part of, and it sounds obvious, but that members are representatives of athletes. But that was another thing that we agreed was a key thing that the future athlete committee would very much stand by. Diversity is crucial. The world population of elite athletes is very diverse. So this is something we want to involve and have very much a part of. The challenge that we have is the more criteria you put in for diversity, the more difficult it is to get a good process. So for example, the key things that we're focusing on are diversity in geography, which means all continents would be represented. It means diversity of gender, so a clear balance of men and women, which tends not to be an issue in many athlete commissions or committees, and also a good spread of sports. We want optimal governance, we want optimal democracy, and obviously we want expertise as well there. We want people that understand anti-doping, but understand certain facets of it. So in an ideal world, we'd love to have a medical doctor on the committee. We'd love to have a lawyer on the committee, because those are key parts of the anti-doping process, as we know. So one of the first things that we were discussing was the size of the athlete committee. Prior to 2020, this year, there were 17 members, 13 were appointed, 4 were ex officio. And then within the governance review, there was a decision to cut make all of the committees the same size, which is 12 members. We had a conversation about this at some length, and there was fairly strong agreement that 12 to be global and to be diverse, to represent athletes, is just not enough. And so we've come to the decision, we're unanimous in it as a working group, that the size of the committee should increase to 15 members. And that is, you'll see that take place within the models that we have. So that was one of the first things that we decided as a committee. Just to be clear, none of this has been decided upon yet. The size remains at 12 at the moment, and I believe and will be for 2021. But these are the things which we're proposing. So we came up with 3 models, A, B, and C. As you can see from the left-hand column, there are 15 members. That remains the same for all the models. In the box below that is the split of the members, which is 3. The primary component of Model A is that members would begin life or come from another athlete committee or commission or athlete council. So they would be transported in, and accordingly, 3 of those 15 would be from International Federation Athlete Commissions. 4 would be from the IOC Athlete Commission, 2 from the IPC Athletes Council, and then 1 from an NOC, 1 from an NPC, 1 from professional sport, and 1 from a recognised sport. Then there would be 2 others who would be there as appointees. So as you can see on the right-hand side at the bottom, those appointees would be to cover any gaps in diversity. The term length would be 3 years. If we look at the top right box, 3 of those members, which would be the 3 IF ones, would be directly elected. So they would basically, all of the IFs or the chairs of the International Olympic federations would have an election, and they would elect 3 people to those IF positions, 2 summer, 1 winter. There'd be 6 nominated positions. They would be the 6 from the IOC and the IPC, Athlete Council stroke Commission, and then the 4 appointed would be the NOC, NPC, and professionals and recognised sports. They would be appointed through a nomination process, and a nomination panel, which I'll come on to a little bit later. Our key element of Model A is that a majority of members have to be elected onto their home athlete commission or council. So all of the time that the WADA athlete committee would be in existence, at least 50% of those members, so 8 or more, would always have to be elected onto their International Federation, IOC, IPC, etc., etc. and that would be one of the roles for the nomination committee, to manage that, to make sure that there were. One last point on Model A, on the diversity. One of the challenges with a model such as this is obviously with ex officios, that organisation gets to choose, or that athlete committee gets to choose which athletes go across. So there may be a higher proportion of athletes from a certain continent, or even certain sports, and therefore the diversity roles, the two appointed diversity roles, would be there to reduce or overcome any issues that had come out of that issue. On to Model B. So again, 15 members, and one of the points here is that all athlete commission members who are currently members around the world would be eligible. There would be 8 from elections by anti-doping organisations that would be organised through anti-doping organisations. So, for example, well, I'll come on to that in a moment, the detail there. So there would be 8 that would be elected there. You would have 1 from the IOC Athletes Commission, 1 from the IPC Athletes Council, and 5 appointed members that would be appointed through the nomination panel that, as I'll touch on later. Again, the term is 3 years. In terms of the electoral process, there would be 8 elected, obviously 2 ex officio, and 5 appointed. The idea being with the appointed that more would be for skills and fewer diversity. So the way the elections would work is that, and bear in mind we're at draft stage, but the way the elections would work is that every anti-doping organisation would be allowed, or athletes from that anti-doping organisation would be have the right to vote and have the right to send a candidate. So if an anti-doping organisation, for example, a major event organiser like the IOC or like a European Championships, etc., there are 25 that are under the WADA code, or the World Anti-Doping Code. Of those, everyone would get a vote. The same with international federations. So the International Federation Athlete Commission, for example, would get the vote and be able to send a candidate. Now, obviously, there's quite a few anti-doping organisations, which are NADOs, that don't have athlete representation within them. This would be one of the things that this model would seek to address. Equally, the ARDO, the anti-doping organisation, or NADO, would have the opportunity to give the vote, if they didn't have their own athlete committee and didn't want to set one up, they would be able to give that vote to another athlete committee or commission within their country. So, for example, they might give it to the NOC Athlete Commission or the NPC Athlete Commission, or a combination of the two. If they wanted, they could set up a temporary group as well. So we've outlined the different options that would be available to the NADOs in that way. And it would be one ADO athlete group, one vote. There are about 350 altogether, and the election would take place online so that everyone would be able to participate, and it wasn't a challenge for people that had financial issues or weren't able to travel to an event. Model C has similarities with Model B. The primary difference is that the committee would not be allowed to have anybody on it who had voting power within the sports movement or the public authorities, the governments. So as I'm sure you're aware, WADA is made up of 50% sports movement, 50% governments, or public authorities as they're known. And the point of this model would be that to reduce potential conflicts of interest and increase independence. It would still enable athletes from current athlete commission members around the world to be elected and participate or be appointed. However, if they had a voting position at their General Assembly or on their board of the wider organisation, the NOC, or a governmental vote, or they were part of a sports council within part of an offshoot of government, they wouldn't be able to be on the WADA Athlete Committee. There'll be 9 elected and 6 appointed. The terms would be 3 years. The voting and the election would be similar to Model B, so each anti-doping organisation would be given a vote for their athlete body, or they would set up an athlete body or pass it to an athlete body in their country, and then the AC would also elect the chair. The appointed would be again more for skills and perhaps a bit less for diversity, the reason being within the election, and this is the same as B, each one of the rules of the election was that there would have to be one person from every continent who gets elected, and also a minimum number of men and women that get elected within the election. Here's a quick slide of some of the commonalities from all of the models. 15 members, as we've said, the terms are the same, 3 years, which is the standard within WADA. All of them utilize a nominations panel. They utilize it to a different degree. The nominations panel would be, or our proposal would be, probably 3, perhaps 5, but probably 3, and it would be a majority athlete member from the WADA Athlete Committee. So, for example, if the elections took place 1 year, the following year would be the appointees. It would work on a 3-year cycle, and the appointees would be 2 of the people that were elected, plus perhaps an expert from the nomination committee, WADA's overall nomination committee. That's our model for the nomination panel. The other commonality is the diversity requirements. They're not exactly the same within the 3 models, but they're very similar. This just gives a quick overview of the different ways that people come into the athlete committee from the different models. Model A, 1 or 2 people have been slightly confused. The purpose of Model A, as I said, is, or to present it like this, is to show that the majority of the members have to be on an athlete committee already or an athlete commission already. So that network is utilized. The majority, the other key point, the majority are elected onto their home athlete committee. So they'd be on the WADA AC, they'd be ex officio members. The 3 that are green are the 3 from IFs, because they would be directly voted onto the WADA AC as well. And the 4 that are white are the appointed members. On B, you've got the 8 who are elected, the 2 ex officios, 1 from the IOC, 1 from the IPC, and the 5 appointed. And C is 9 elected and 6 appointed. Within all of this, all of the members would have the same rights, the same responsibilities. They wouldn't be seen as more of a member or have any less voting or input like that. So one other comparison is the nomination panels. This effectively just shows the different roles that the nomination panel would have over the 3 years. In year 1, if with B and C, it would have the significant job of overseeing the election. Years 2 and 3 they'd have less work to do. On Model A, there would be probably less work to do in terms of an election, but there are quite a few smaller elections and appointments going on. So over the 3 years, they probably have a busier role, but it would be more spread over the 3. Key points would be checking on diversity criteria, on eligibility, that everyone's verification of their eligibility. And also the other thing for Model A would be checking that there were always a majority who are elected onto their home or resident athlete commission. So that's the models, that's the purpose and the principles. So far, feedback to date from our own athlete committee, they've been very clear that athletes should be deciding who's on the committee. They're also very clear that it should be 15 members, and they were pleased that there were 3 models. Initially, we just had 2, and they asked for a third, so we came back to them on that. The SM is the sports movement, generally led by the IOC. They're in agreement with the 15 members as well. Their preference is Model A. The majority elected is a primary goal, as we've mentioned, and they're keen that the existing athlete commission system is used. The public authority feedback that we've received to date, some are still considering, others are very clear in their position. We had a meeting just 2 days ago, actually, with some of the governments from the Americas region. They're keen that there's a very broad range of athletes. They're not sure whether the existing representative structure is an appropriate one. Those that have set a preference, which is probably more than less, is that B or C is their preference. And that was also came out at the executive committee meeting that WADA held in September. They also say they need more detail and confidence on the elections and how they would work. So that's some of the feedback that we've received to date. The next steps are to continue to communicate and consult. We need to identify common ground and build on it. Basically, we're in quite different positions in terms of the decision makers, which is ultimately the foundation board and executive committee at WADA, the sports movement and governments. And at the moment, they're in different places. So unless one of them moves into the other place, we need to come up with some common ground. We probably need to create some newer models, some new models as well, which have that middle ground on it, and both sides and people are going to be probably going to need to excuse me, cooperate and compromise somewhat. We also need to establish some eligibility criteria, but we're parking that until we've got a bit more clarity on the model, and the athlete committee would decide, not the working group that we've set up, which is effectively a subcommittee of the athlete committee, but it would be an athlete committee decision on the proposal that would go to the foundation board and the executive committee. They would then say yes or no, and then we would go from there. I think that's it from me, and then I think we're now going over to Chelsey. So thanks very much for listening.
Perfect, thanks Adam. So now that you have a better understanding of the models that we're proposing so far, and you've seen the work that's gone into the working group that we've put together, one of the other really important pieces that we had to consider was mapping out what anti-doping looks like right now. So we'll jump to the next slide. So we really need to get a lay of the land of where we are so we can figure out where we need to go from here. So we conducted an exercise figuring out what the current landscape looks like within athlete representation globally, so across all anti-doping organizations. And when I talk about anti-doping organizations, I'm talking about the NOCs, the NPCs, the IFs, and the multi-event organizers. So with that, I also included the professional associations or independent athlete bodies, and of course the NADOs as well. So this is the group that we're looking at. As Adam mentioned, it's over 300 stakeholders that we're evaluating, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done outside of just collecting pure data as far as who has representation. We also need to look at how effective they are, how each of them are set up, what representation means to them. So one of the big things is the NATO survey that we just conducted recently. We sent a survey out to all 146 NATOs to get an idea of where they are with athlete representation right now. 107 of those responded to the survey, which is pretty good feedback for us. And then out of that, we were able to get a lot of interesting information at first glance to get an idea of where each of them are with athlete representation, and also identify some of the issues that there may be within organizations right now, or where they may need further assistance from us to be able to set up appropriate athlete representation models that are more effective. And on to the results of the NATO survey that we have. So out of the 107 that responded, 62 of them responded that they do have a metric for engaging athletes within their governance structure. 30 of them responded that they have an actual athletes committee within their NATO. 45 have athletes that sit at the decision-making table and developing policy for the NATO with respect to athletes. And then finally, 95 of them said that they engage with athletes in some of the in different ways, whether it's seminars, webinars, events that are hosted through the NATO to get athlete feedback. So as you see, this is a pretty diverse information. There's definitely some work that needs to be done to be able to better give athletes a voice within the anti-doping ecosystem, and we're keen to help do that. But we also need to figure out what athlete representation means to each of these organizations, and how we can better serve them and get them up to speed with what we would expect as the WADA athlete committee for representation, because there is quite diverse numbers when you're talking about 45 athletes that are at a table, only 30 have athlete committees, but then 95 claim that they're engaging athletes. So what does that engagement actually look like? And do athletes actually feel like they are being engaged in the NATO? So from here, we're also going to take this information in conjunction with the data that we have about our NOCs, our NPCs, and our IFs, and be able to put it all together to create more of a larger landscape of what the ecosystem looks like. And from there, it'll help us define the actual athlete committee, what our expectations are of all of the stakeholders of WADA, and be able to move forward with more of an effective athlete representative voice overall within anti-doping. And that's it for me, and I'll hand it back over to Ben to moderate some questions.
Thanks, Chelsey. Thanks, Adam. Thanks everyone for listening to the presentations. If you have questions, please go to the tab which should be on your screen and write the question in there. I don't have too many questions so far, so either we'll be finishing early or there'll be a rush of questions now. I guess the first question is, Adam, probably directed to you. What's the time frame for the next steps?
Yeah, that's
hopefully.
We would hope to have this finished and rounded up by May, the foundation board meeting in May. I say that with some reservation, I suppose, because there's quite a lot of consultation required. We still need to speak more to athletes and more athletes. I think getting a unified position from athlete groups will be challenging as well, as we found with the governing governments and sports movement. So ideally it would be May, but trying to have a good consultation process where everyone has the opportunity to speak, and trying to pin people down, getting hold of governments isn't very easy. It might not be May, but I hope it is.
Thanks. And this is probably a good question to segue into some further questions. So it's, once you figure out what the model will be and get it approved, what do you want to achieve within WADA in terms of athlete representation besides just reforming the athlete committee? So I can probably start that, and then Chelsey or Adam, you can continue that. So it's sort of a two-step process. So we want to get the athlete committee representation side of things sorted, and then we want to be able to get voting positions on the exco and the foundation board, but we need to get the representation within the athlete committee sorted first before we go down the path of asking for a seat on the foundation board or exco. Do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, I can. I would say also for us, once we have that understanding of what representation is and a clearer idea of where we're going with the athlete committee, it's then being really structured and streamlined with how we go about the work that we're doing, so that we're more proactive in how we engage the athlete community, but also our stakeholders outside of the athlete community, so that we're not being as reactive. Not that we're reactive, but we're being more proactive with how we're approaching different projects and education pieces, and how we're working within the WADA system that is currently set up, so that we can be most effective on behalf of the athlete community. And whether that's creating a strategy or streamlining what we're doing year to year with the overall strategic plan of the organization, those are all really important for us to be able to sort of look ahead and then brainstorm what is important and what's on our radar as an athlete committee, so that we can serve athletes better.
Yeah. Sorry, you go, Adam.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd just add, to follow up from Ben's point, I think in terms of representation, and this is a personal view, within representation within WADA on decision-making bodies, there have recently, I think today it was announced even, that there are now 2 independent members on the executive committee. My view would be that athletes are such a central stakeholder in anti-doping, and therefore there should be at least 2 positions on the exco as well. The foundation board is a much bigger body, so accordingly the same. So that would be one view. I definitely agree with what Chelsey is saying. I think we as a committee can have really probably more clarity in terms of our direction and also outreach as well. I'd like to see us, I finish quite soon, but I'd like to see us in the future going to meet more athletes and more athlete groups and interacting with them, and both passing out information but also listening and hearing what they're saying a lot as well.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up those comments by saying also one of the purposes is to try and increase athlete representation within anti-doping more generally. And as we can see from the survey that we conducted with NADOs, there is still a lot of room for improvement within anti-doping organisations around athlete representation. So it would be my belief anyway that if an organisation is making rules that are affecting athletes, then athletes should have a say in how those rules are developed and implemented. And so, depending on which model we go with and which model gets approved, then that's going to affect that sort of interaction with anti-doping organisations across the board. And then we'll be able to sort of develop a way forward to try and encourage further athlete representation within anti-doping. Okay, we've had a flurry of questions. Let me just see. Here's one. The IOC Athlete Commission members swear to the Olympic oath to support the IOC positions. Given this is WADA Athlete Committee, would you consider that a conflict of interest? If not, why? I'll start that off just by saying, conflicts of interest are definitely something that, we are concerned about, and that Model C directly deals with. The other models, don't to the same degree. But I'll hand that over to you, Adam.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why Model C is there, because some people expressed the view that they felt that it's an athlete committee, it should be there to represent athletes, and that doesn't mean to say that people on the other athlete commissions wouldn't represent athletes at all, but it does perhaps make it more challenging. I think if you have two roles within an organisation: an internal role where you're on an advisory body, like an athlete committee. You're advising the board, you're advising the management on athlete issues and athlete perspectives. You're obviously and very clearly representing athletes. When you step outside of that organisation, it then becomes a bit unclear. You're elected or appointed to an internal advisory body. It then becomes a bit unclear or opaque whether you're representing the organisation or you're and it's not always easy. I've certainly been in that position myself and found it challenging, and I think other people have as well. So that's why Model B was there. It doesn't mean it's the right way to go. It doesn't mean it's the best way to go, but it's certainly one of the options that we have on the table. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that the public authorities, well, and the sports movement, both sides, there's a delicate balance of 50-50 at the moment, and across the decision-making bodies. And were that to be upset and one of the parties thought that the other had an extra seat or seats or more power, that would cause quite a lot of challenges. So both sides, both the sports movement and the governments, need to be happy and confident that the athletes committee is not speaking to one of the other groups or on behalf of one of the other groups, but is there representing athletes and only athletes.
And I think just to add to that, there's also an element to, I agree with Adam's comments there. For example, though, like I'm technically part of the IPC Athletes Council, and I sit on the governing board of the IPC. So when I'm in my IPC role, I'm doing what's best for the IPC moving forward in the Paralympic movement. As a member of the WADA Athlete Committee, I'm representing Paralympic athletes generally. I'm not representing the IPC. I'm representing our athlete community within WADA's landscape of anti-doping and the programming they're doing. So I'm bringing that voice forward rather than the IPC's voice. And I think that's something that needs to be noted as well, because I think that there's a lot of people that jump to the conclusion that, we're representing the organization that we're there on behalf, but it's not as simple as that. We're representing the athletes from the movement that we're part of.
Thanks, Chelsey. Thanks, Adam. Next question, it's part statement, part question, and it's a little bit long, so bear with me. It starts off, why not think differently? To have true independent athlete representation, the WADA Athlete Committee should be independent of WADA and can be tied to WADA through rules of engagement. It must operate as a collective whereby it has independent legal, governance, expertise, and so on, have full-time staff person that is hired by the AC, and sort of the CRC within WADA has some independence, and WADA's I&I department is independent. Why not give the most important stakeholder more independence? Again, I'll start this off and then hand it over to Adam and Chelsey. There has been some discussion, not so much in terms of the athlete committee, but I think in terms of a broader picture of athlete representation within WADA. There's what's known as the tripartite system, which has been something that's been promoted and seems to me anyway to be quite widely supported. The basis of that would be, so at the moment within WADA, as Adam has explained, you have this 50-50 balance between the PAs and the Olympic movement, and the tripartite system would essentially be a third athletes, a third the Olympic movement, and a third the public authorities. And I think this sort of independence is something that probably comes up more if we were to walk down that path, because you would need some way to have that third of athletes and that third of athletes be separated, I guess, enough from the PAs and the sports movement. And whether you did that through one whole independent collective, or whether you did that by bringing all the different stakeholder athlete groups to the table for WADA in terms of like sharing out positions. You know, those are questions that would have to be looked at more, I think, if that was the overall sort of governance structure which WADA wanted to adopt. But although we've looked at the tripartite system, it's not something which we're you know, going into a huge amount of detail with, and would obviously need a large amount of buy-in from the existing stakeholders to want to reform WADA in that way, and the athlete groups around the world as well pushing for that. Adam, Chelsey, you guys want to add anything there?
Well, we've obviously, as you know, Ben, had the discussion in terms of within the working group. It was one of the other things that WADA Athlete Committee, when we consulted with them and came back to them, were keen that we talk about. The reason being, at last year's 2019 WADA symposium, there was some athlete sessions, and one of them, during one of them, a proposal that came out was about the tripartite system, with the third on the foundation board and an independent executive committee. And that was well supported around the room with the athletes that were there. And consequently, it was asked that we have a conversation about that. It's not strictly speaking what we've been asked to do as a working group, but in principle, the working group is supportive of the idea. I would be keen that the foundation board started to have discussions and conversations about the idea as well, and see how it might develop in future. I do think athletes are the main stakeholder within sport and anti-doping. They're the stakeholder that's most effective and most affected, but unfortunately they're the stakeholder that often has the least say. I've sat on athlete commissions and committees for many years. It's been a privilege to do so. However, one of the things I have become very aware of is that as athletes, to create change or to have an impact or to develop things or to get your voice into action, it's very much dependent on the view of the president and the person who's making the decisions, because the voting power that athletes tend to have is quite limited. At best, it tends to be 1 out of about 12 or 15. So I certainly think that's worthy of further conversation, and I would like the foundation board to give it real consideration and look into it further.
I don't think I have too much. Sorry, go ahead, Ben.
No, sorry, I was just going to add that WADA's governance reforms are an ongoing process, and there is a newly set up working group on governance reform, and so I would also expect that this is something that is proposed to them, and that this is one of the things that they look at. And obviously we've been looking at it to a certain degree and within our working group, and are supportive of it, but it's something that needs more thought, and you know, that question around independence of the athlete committee really becomes paramount, I think, within the tripartite system, or how you would have that 1/3 athlete makeup.
Yeah, I was going to add something similar to what Ben just said, and I think if we got to a place where that system was the direction WADA was going, it could be a model for use. But if the system doesn't go towards that, I think the idea of an independent athlete group wouldn't necessarily be as effective as it's supposed to be, as it's desired to being. I think there's a lot of complexities to being independent from an organization, yet still having your staff paid by that organization and your budget coming from that organization. So we have to work out the complexities of that. And then how you also are part of internal discussions and decisions if you're actually independent from the organization. So there's just a lot of questions asked. So unless there was more of the buy-in from the foundation board, in reforming in the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. I couldn't see a model like independent being the ideal model for our current structure that we have in place. But as Ben said, everything's unfolding and we're constantly reviewing the governance.
Thanks. I don't think there's really any more. I'm just looking here to see if anything else is coming in. There's a question: athletes competing in professional leagues and university sports are for an important part not subject to the code. Is the objective for these athlete groups to become subject to the code before they have a voice on the WADA AC? Yes, yeah, I'll pass this to Adam, but yes, like in terms of all the, when we talk about the players' unions, in terms of WADA, we're talking about the ones that are subject to the code. So, you know, football, rugby, cricket, baseball, not in the US, but elsewhere, ice hockey, other than the US. So I think the main ones that are not subject to the code are the main professional leagues in the US and university sport in the US. And obviously, because they're not subject to the code, they wouldn't be part of the AC. Have I summed that up, Adam?
Yeah, very well. It's interesting. There was a similar question from the Americas, not the Americans, but from parts of the Americas continental region a couple of days ago, and we made it clear that the committee would only have members on it who were from sports or anti-doping organisations or countries that were bound by the code.
Yeah, and yeah, I think one of the things at the moment is that there's quite a bit of media and back and forwards about the leagues in the US and university sport in the US not being subject to the code and having developed their own separate anti-doping rules. And yeah, that's not something that we're dealing with through this. That's probably a much wider question for WADA to be dealing with. There's one more question that's come in. No, it's not a question. So that probably sums up or finishes our webinar. If you have any more questions, that come to you after this, or you want to get in contact with us, please contact me. My email address I have put into the questions, but if you can't see it, it's Sandford, sandford.ben@gmail.com, and then I can share that with Adam and Chelsey and with the working group and the athlete committee if need be. So thank you very much. I hope you found this entertaining but mainly informative. And obviously athlete representation is exceptionally important, and we've been working hard to try and come up with models and make improvements within WADA and within anti-doping when it comes to athlete representation. So any comments that you have, any feedback that you have would be greatly received. Please stay on the online and fill in the survey that comes to you after this. And I'd like to thank Adam and Chelsey an enormous amount for doing the presentations and speaking today. And obviously this is the last webinar that we are presenting to athletes this year. So thank you for tuning in this year. It's been a pretty remarkable year for a lot of wrong reasons. And so hopefully next year there might be less webinars and more in-person meetings. but we'll just have to wait and see how things develop. So have a good Christmas and New Year's break if you do, and we'll be back here in the new year with some more webinars, which we hope you'll join us again. So thank you very much, and Adam and Chelsey, thank you very much for today, and take care, everyone.